Good afternoon, everyone, or good evening for me. I'm coming to you from Sydney this evening, where it's about 11:30. As I begin, I just want to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the traditional lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. That's the indigenous tribe from here. I'd like to pay my respect to elders past, present, and emerging. All right. What we're going to do for about the next 45 minutes is I'm going to take us on a tour through what we have learned in the past 3 years, because effectively we started from knowing nothing about how to use the modern era of generative AI into a set of practices. And what I want to do is walk through those practices. Those practices are both what we're doing with usage, but also about how we need to think about it and how we need to govern AI. All of this is part of what we've learned over the last 3 years. So you have to remember, it was November the 30th, 2022, that ChatGPT was released basically almost as a bit of a joke by OpenAI. They didn't really think it would do very well, and it took off. And what happened is it catalyzed a change in how we think about how we use computers. Now, the one thing that has been absolutely consistent across all of this is that everything has been changing. Nothing is anywhere near where it was 3 years ago, and we can already see that there are much bigger changes ahead. I was talking to someone 2 weeks ago, and they turned to me and said, "Mark, you are using the worst AI today that you will ever use." And really, if you consider how much better the AI systems that we use today is than the systems that we were using 3 years ago, you can understand what they mean by that. And the systems we're using 3 years from now will be better still than the systems that we're using today. All right. Let's start at the beginning. Let's talk about what AI systems you want to use. And there's a lot of options on offer out there. But what I really want us to do is I want us to focus on what we call the frontier models. These are the models that are regularly scoring the highest benchmarks when they're put to test. And they're also the ones that have had the most money put into their development. And for best results here, I'm going to make a strong recommendation that you only use the latest frontier models in any work connected to your organization. Personal use, yeah, okay, you can get away with something that's not as good. But if you're using it for your organization, always make a decision to use the latest frontier models. So what are those? Well, ChatGPT 5.2 Pro, that's from OpenAI, so the original creators of ChatGPT. That was released only a week ago. It's very, very good. Google's Gemini 3 Pro, and you got to understand, this race is basically Google's to lose because Google invented the basic technology of generative AI back in 2017 and then shelved it until OpenAI came around. Since then, they've been playing catch up. It seems that with Gemini 3, which is very good, they have actually effectively caught up to, if not surpassed, ChatGPT in quality. So that's another very good one. And then there's Anthropic, a company you might not have heard of. Anthropic is essentially the child of a divorce that happened at OpenAI in 2020. Half of the founders stayed at OpenAI. The other half of the founders said, we're going to focus on safety and we're going to make our models very safe. So that's Anthropic. They have a series of models called Claude. The latest of those is Claude Opus 4.5, also came out last month. Which of these models is better than any of the others? They're all basically very good, and they're all also head and shoulders above anything we were using even a year ago. That's how fast they're getting good now. All right, so now we made a decision, okay, we're going to use a frontier model. One of the things you need to think about with a frontier model is you have to pay for them in general. Sometimes you can use a free version, but you only get limited usage. So how much are you going to pay? You're going to pay sort of 10, 15, 20 pounds a month on a subscription for those products. It's worth it. And this is the thing we need to be very clear on. Some people ask, well, can you use Copilot? And that'll probably come up as one of the questions you'd be asking. And the answer to there is, well, maybe, but Microsoft tends to be a generation behind the current latest model. And so in a lot of ways, using Copilot means you're not going to be using the latest and greatest. It might be free to your organization because you have a license, but you won't be getting the best possible results. Something to think about and factor into when you make a decision about which model you're going to use. All right. How do you use AI? Well, This is the thing that's changed the most. We started from basically knowing nothing about how to use AI effectively, and now we actually have a body of practices. And I want to walk through how those practices have evolved. When ChatGPT was released, essentially we used them as question-answer chatbots, right? We just pose a question, you get an answer, pose another question, get an answer, kind of like a Google, and it's kind of replaced Google in some ways. That was effective, but it wasn't really the whole story. It was the beginning of a process of our learning how to use AI effectively. The thing that we're really starting to learn is that almost all of our interactions with AI are probably best considered as evolving conversations around a topic or a task. Now, very basic level, again, to come back to what we were doing 3 years ago, is ask and answer. You can ask a chatbot, what's the capital of Finland? It's going to say the capital of Finland is Helsinki. You can ask it to give that answer in rhyme. You can ask it to give that answer in Finnish if you want. All of those things are possible, but it's this very simple ask and answer. And many people, for much of the time, that will cover a lot of the uses that they need for a fact, some sort of factual information. And so it's a good use, but it really sort of doesn't scratch more than the surface of what's possible by having an in-depth interaction with AI. All right, next up, it's having a conversation by example. So let's say that you have a document that has a whole bunch of information in it. Some of that information are addresses, and it's just in the document. And you want the AI to be able to pull out all of the addresses in that document and give them to you in another document. So you can say to the AI, this is what an address looks like, and you can give it 1 or 2 or 3 examples of what an address looks like. And then you can say, here's a document. Pull out all of the addresses in this document. Or is this an address if you refer to what was in that document, all right? And we call that training by example. And it allows the AI to classify because we've given it an example of something in the class of information that we're looking for. The AI can then search through the document, find things that do match, and say, well, here's the addresses in that document, or this is not an address because so on and so forth. So this power to classify information unlocked, and this was one of the things we found sort of within the first 6 months after ChatGPT was released. It unleashed the power for people to be able to take what we call unstructured data. So that's data that is not formally covered by some sort of structure that allows it to be easily digested by a computer program and allows that data to be restructured in a way that can be taken in by another IT system or designed for consumption by another human being by reformatting it. So this by example technique, it's not sophisticated, but it's very powerful. And we've only really just started using this well across our organizations. I was working with an organization in Papua New Guinea, which was using this in order to actually clean up the input for their accounts payables, because people would be submitting invoices that would be handwritten and would be very, very difficult to make out. And you'd be able to use AI to fill in the missing information and to enter that into your accounts payable system and get those accounts paid. All right. The next level up is what we call chain of thought. Chain of thought is where you show the AI in a step-by-step process how to solve a particular class of problem. And the classic example here is long division, where you can say, okay, I have 763, I'm going to divide it by 38. What am I going to do? I'm going to find out how many 38s go into 76, and then I'm going to take the remainder, and so on. And so you'll solve the long division. And you write that out in detail and feed that into the AI system. And then you say, okay, now show me how many 46s can go into 820. And then what it will do is it will follow the rules that have been laid down in the information you've given it, the rules of long division, and it will solve the long division problem. And it will show you the work while it's solving that problem. So we call that chain of thought. The kinds of problems that you can solve with chain of thought, they're not infinitely large, but they're quite large. As long as you can break the problem down clearly into clear steps that the computer is then able to follow one after another, you've presented enough of a trail, enough of essentially what would be a computer program that the computer can use when it is answering questions put to it. So this is a very powerful technique that can be used to solve relatively sophisticated problems doing AI. And the capacity of AI systems to be able to analyze and solve chain of thought classes of problems has increased dramatically over the last 3 years. All right, so these are all sort of techniques that we have discovered pretty much within the first year of using AI systems. A lot of people have been using AI systems now for 3 years. And one of the things that's been the case is almost all of these AI systems have maintained a memory of all of the interactions of all of the people using these AI systems. And that memory of interactions has been used to train subsequent versions of these AI systems. And this means that most of these AI systems are now sitting on a wealth of information about the kinds of instructions that worked well with an AI system and the kinds of instructions that did not work well. And that means we can now partner with them. We can co-create with them to develop the most effective way to be able to talk to them. Now, this sounds a little bit like cheating. Hey, can you help me solve this problem that I have? How do I need to structure the command to you that would allow me to do this particular task? What follows at that point is interactive. The computer may in fact ask you more questions about this task. What kind of data? What kind of documents? What are you looking for? What's the output? Okay, now that we understand the problem together well, because we've worked through it together, here's how you need to ask me to solve that problem for you. In other words, what we can do is we can leverage all of the learning and all of the experiences people have already had to help the AI system design the question that we want to put to it. So, again, to go back to our question about how to sort through different kinds of addresses in a document, you'd ask the AI, what's the best prompt to instruct you how to sort valid from invalid addresses in the list of contexts that are found in this document that I'm feeding into you. And it'll look at the document and say, oh, I think the best way for you to be able to do this for me is to give me this kind of prompt. So effectively what you had to do is you've had to ask the starter question. It's like, I have this problem I need to solve. Help me solve this problem. Help me understand how to talk to you so that we can solve this problem together. So in this case, what we've done is we've really shifted the emphasis, where the AI is now more of a partner rather than just a tool, because the tool itself is smart enough to instruct you on how to use it well. This goes back to a wonderful old concept in computer science known as the read, evaluate, print loop. And for anyone who used an old, say, a ZX81 when you booted it up and you started typing in your basic commands, or perhaps an old PDP system, there are a bunch of older systems that work like this where you're basically engaging in a repeated interaction because you're designing a program or building a program. And really, it's an umbrella term for this style of having a conversation geared toward a goal. And it turns out this is a great way for us to be working with all of our AI systems. So when we walk up to an AI system with a task that needs to be done, we need to think about it as entering into a conversation that will culminate in the completion of the task, rather than something that we have to get right on the first try. And this is where the burden is now leaving us, because in fact, the computer is going to be a partner in us solving our problem. So you don't have to think about doing this on your own. You don't have to think about getting it right. And I think a lot of people are worried when they're talking to an AI that they're not going to get the problem right. And in fact, what you just need to do is approach the system with a little bit of humility and go, okay, I don't really understand how to solve this problem. You and I are going to work together on that solution. And if you do that and learn how to do that well, you will find yourself almost always getting the results you want, probably faster than you would if you just tried to do everything yourself. Okay. So that's kind of the current state of the art. You may have heard a term that's floating around now, agents or agentic AI. This is the transition that we're in because we've grown used to how to use AI to solve basic tasks. Now we're looking at using AI to solve more complex tasks, tasks that can be broken down into different chains of tasks. So we need to step back and say, okay, well, what is an agent? You hear this term, what does it really mean? Well, an agent is an AI that is given a goal. And once it has that goal, which is given to them by a person, the AI will then work methodically to the completion of that goal. Now, we've had experiments in making agents for 30 years. It really wasn't until ChatGPT came along that they seemed to be able to do a reasonable job at being able to work from a goal to a completed task. But even in those early days, it was very common for them to sort of fall apart at some point. It's only sort of within the last 6 months now that agents are starting to get good enough that people are starting to understand that we can use these as tools. So when you talk about them as a tool, we're really talking about a tool, an agent, that has 3 core components. The first thing it has is a goal, which is provided by you. You walk up and say, here's this task I need to perform. All right. In order to do that, in order to perform that goal, the AI itself has to have access to what we call memory and context. So the thing about all modern AI systems is actually they don't have any memory at all. When you are having a conversation with an AI and it's back and forth and back and forth, every time there's a back and forth, the AI actually reads the entire conversation to that point back in. It's starting from 0 every time. And then it will say, okay, this is how far I am in the conversation. This is the appropriate answer to the next point in the conversation. Another time, again, reads in the whole conversation. 3 years ago, the amount of memory that these systems could handle was relatively small, and now it's actually about an order of magnitude larger. So there's a lot of memory for a deep conversation that you might be having with an agent. And context is, again, how the agent decides it's going to maintain all of the things that it needs to remember. And it turns out the modern agents, the agents that we've seen in the last 3 months, essentially create their own to-do lists and use those as a source of truth while they're solving a problem, very much like a person would do. And so that's also going into the memory. So as you're having a part of a conversation with an agent, it's remembering the things it needs to keep track of, and the system is keeping track of the conversation. Now, the final thing that an agent needs is it needs an ability to assess its actions. In other words, we call this the reflective capacity, because if you have a goal and the goal is broken down into a discrete number of steps, and these steps have a discrete number of actions associated with them, as the agent works from its very first step and its very first action on and on and on, at the end of every action, it needs to be able to check to say, did I do that right? And often it won't know that. You may have to provide the information that it needs so that it can sense check, because otherwise an agent can do something wrong, not know that it did it wrong, because it doesn't necessarily know what result is to be expected at a particular stage in a task. And then it will just continue blindly on, using that bad result to power the rest of the agent, and the agent will fail. And this was a very common occurrence 3 years ago, much less common now because we've gotten much better at building agents that can assess their actions as they're performing them. So the big thing that we've learned, and there has been a huge amount of research in this topic, particularly within the last 3 months, is that in order for our agents to work reliably, we need to be very explicit about how we decompose a goal into a set of discrete actions. You can say, all right, I want to perform this task. I want to be able to sort of maybe take a measurement of all the finances in one division of the company. All right, so that's a goal. But discrete actions is, well, okay, you're going to need to take a look at the financials in each of the divisions, and then maybe down another level into each of the departments. You're going to need to take a look at projections 6 months out and maybe the actuals from 6 months ago, so on and so forth. And you have to perform those actions in a particular sequence. And as you're doing that, you also need to then check the outcome of every one of those actions. Did it work? Did it not work? If the agent assesses that an action did not work, it will then go back and think of another way of completing the action. It's like, okay, obviously my strategy, my mechanism for completing this action did not work. Let me think about another way of performing this action, and it will try it another way and then assess its result again. And it will do this over and over and over until it can assess that it thinks it has done the step correctly. And this has been the big hang-up, because quite often what would happen, particularly in early agents, is that it would fail an assessment test and try another way and fail that, and so on and so forth. We've gotten a lot better at that now. So we now have what we call an agent half-life, which is measured in the number of steps that an agent can solve without creating an error. And that was probably measured in less than 10 steps 3 years ago. The most recent research has shown an agent that can be accurate up to 1 million steps. But how did they do that? Well, there's a bit of magic here, which when you take a look at it actually makes a lot of sense. An agent works well when it's very well instructed. And by the way, this is a generic way to work with any AI system these days when you have a complex task, not just with agents. The thing you need to do is you need to take a look at the workflow to come to a goal, and you need to break that workflow down. And once you've broken that workflow down into discrete steps, you need to break it down even more into discrete actions, and then probably break it down even more. How can you get those actions so that they are as simple and as testable as possible? And when you can't break it down anymore, that's probably the point at which it's really good to be able to say to an agent, this is the goal. Here's what I think is a good strategy for reaching that goal. Let's work together on a solution. And again, from the research that was shown just a few months ago, if you're really good at decomposing workflows, you can get agents that can handle multiple thousands of steps and do so correctly because they've got such good guidance. And to come back to my main point here, that sounds like a lot of work. You do not have to do it yourself. You need to get the AI to work with you to decompose a workflow into discrete actions. In other words, let the AI help you co-design the agent with you so that you create the step-by-step plan that will allow you to go from goal to solution because you have completely described the problem. And this is where I think we're going to see a lot of innovation over the next year, because everyone wants to get agents. Agents can be amazing productivity tools. But in order to get agents to work really well, what we're going to have to do is become really good at describing the tasks that the agent has to perform and the kinds of tests that the agent needs to make sure that each of its steps are performing correctly. And you can sum it up really easily. Agents need a goal. They absolutely need a goal. We have to give them that goal, but they really love a plan. And the more detailed that plan is, the better in general the results from the agent. Now, there are limits here because agents have a limited amount of memory, even though it's larger than it used to be. If your discrete plan is so big that it's really crowding most of the memory of the AI while it's working, you may need to think about breaking that process up so that you're using multiple agents, each of which is getting to a particular stage in the goal, and then putting those together. So you need to even decompose the process further. Okay, so when we talk about agents, it really kind of raises the specter of, is AI getting so well that none of us are going to have jobs anymore? And the one thing that we've seen, particularly in the last year, is that there are particular sectors that have been completely driven out of employment by AI. And the most obvious one is copywriters. Copywriters are basically disappearing as a class now because it is so easy to get AI to generate good enough copy. So we have to ask all of ourselves, well, what's the position of our work? How do we stand in relation to AI in the workforce? And it's a good question, and we don't have all of the answers yet. But one of the rules of thumb here is when you're doing any process that you're using AI to automate, and you're breaking that process down into steps and into tasks and into actions, it will quickly become clear which of those steps and tasks and actions can be easily and effectively automated and which cannot. In other words, which tasks look like they're essentially human or benefit enormously from having human input. Almost all workflows in any organization will be a mix of these two. And this is where we come to an interesting point. Do we then redesign all of our workflows so that every element in that workflow can be automated? Or do we think very carefully about how we actually accentuate human input in these workflows and really allow it to realize its full value? And we need to be very careful here because one of the guiding maxims of computer science is to err is human and to screw up its scale takes a computer. So completely automating a process is not necessarily going to give anyone the results they actually want for that process. It turns out that a rich mix of automation and human input is probably the best mix. And the thing that we've seen now is the wisest organizations are the ones that are not replacing humans, but are amplifying them by using these new tools. Case in point, there's a very large bank here in Australia that basically let one of its entire client-facing call centers just fired them, let them go because they said, oh, we have the AI is good enough. In a month, they had to rehire everyone because, in fact, the AI call center wasn't capable of answering the same class or quality of questions. And some of this has to do with the fact that the AI is going to be able to answer the basic questions, but when you get into particularly specific problems, the AI is not going to have the data set or the training to be able to work from, and it's not going to be able to deliver effective answers, or worse, it will give wrong answers. And probably enough of that happened to basically change the direction of the company. Now, that's one way of thinking about how to use AI, and it's, of course, the one that's the terror of workers, that we're just going to be put out of work by AI. But in fact, what we've seen is other organizations taken another tack. And they're using AI basically as the first level of customer service so that the easy questions get answered by the AI and the customer goes away quickly and happily. But anything that's more sophisticated immediately gets passed along to a person to solve. So the person actually gets more interesting work. Customers are still going away happy because they're getting the quality of service that they need. And so we see these different approaches here. And I think in the long run, what we're going to see is that the value of humans is in our ability to function across a range of situations which would confound an AI. All right, it is time to talk about the things we need to do right and very carefully when we use AI, because we're starting to see a lot of AI used in a lot of situations before people have really thought through the implications of using AI in those situations. And the first of those situations that we need to think about is confidentiality. You must never put personally identifiable information, private information, commercial and confidence information, or legally restricted information into a public chatbot. So if you're just using ChatGPT on the web or Gemini or Claude, you must not put confidential information. And of course, this almost sounds like it should be a no-brainer, but we saw in August of 2023 that there were a bunch of employees at Australia's Department of Defence in Canberra who were using ChatGPT inside the secure part of the building. We don't actually know what kind of information got typed into ChatGPT, but it's very possible that classified information ended up being put into that system. So you need to think about this very carefully. Now, some organizations will have either a private instance of one of these frontier models, or they'll have an internal AI model that they're using that is domiciled within the business. In those cases, the confidentiality is assured because you're having local processing or private processing of the data. But in an organization where you don't know whether that's the case, you need to be extremely careful with what you do with your information. And again, data security falls under this as well. When you hit that enter bar, the information is going somewhere else. Yes, you may have a copy of that information, but that data is also going to reside somewhere else. And you're now dependent on that third party to maintain data security for that information. So what happens to that information that you type in? How long is it retained? Is it used to train the model? Which means, could it pop out as an answer from someone else's question a year from now? So you need to think carefully about data security when you are using any public AI model. And then you need to think about extraterritoriality, because data centers are located everywhere. We do have a few data centers here in Australia, but most of the time our data is probably being processed either in Singapore or over in the United States. And you need to think about the extraterritoriality of data, because there's certain kinds of data that's not allowed to leave a country for legal reasons, for very clear legal reasons. So do you know where the AI is located? Do you know where its data center is located? Do you know if it's preserving a copy in order to satisfy the terms of its own legal requirements where it's domiciled? Something, again, that we need to think about at an organizational level when we're using AI. And finally, hallucinations. So when ChatGPT came out 3 years ago, hallucinations were a pretty severe and common problem. And you could reliably expect that sort of 1 out of every 10 responses that were generated by ChatGPT or a similar system could be factually incorrect. And that's because these systems have no internal sense check to be able to go, is this true, is this false, does this seem reasonable or not? And because these systems are also designed to produce responses that look very reasonable, even if they're completely wrong. So it's very easy to find yourself in a position where you could be relying on information that has no factual basis. And so one of the things we need to do when we're using these systems is do an internal sense check. Do I know enough about the nature of the problem that I'm solving in partnership with the AI to understand whether it is giving me good advice or not? And if you find yourself in that situation, I guess the first level is to go put the problem to another AI and compare results. But really the gold standard here is to go find a human expert and put the question to them. Should I trust this information? It's not a difficult thing to do, but it's something we need to keep in mind. And of course, again, these systems always sound very reasonable. And because they always sound very reasonable, we are inclined to trust them. And that's not necessarily always the best policy. Governance. Okay. So if you are an organization and you're thinking of bringing AI into the organization, my first recommendation to you, and I've seen this happen a lot, is that you start with an AI working group. You take stakeholders from around the organization and bring them together to understand the dimensions of what AI will mean to the organization. And you can really do that across 3 different axes. You can take a look at the policies that the organization is going to need, the practices that the organization will adopt, and the protocols that the organization will observe. So let's start with policies. This is really important. Again, while experimenting with AI should be encouraged, there also needs to be some rules of the road. We need to actually give some thought about where, when, and why we would be using AI in any particular department, in any particular workflow, for any particular task. And just as important, we need to be very clear about when never to use it. For example, I did a bunch of consulting at the beginning of this year with various law firms here in Australia. And There's a big difference between using it in the back office to help do some of the administrative work and using it for primary legal tasks. And one of the things AI can be very good at is it can be very good at finding and pulling out relevant information from huge corpuses of documents, which is generally a task for junior lawyers. But here's the thing, while it can do it, it does that incompletely, and it can hallucinate when it's doing that. So if you're relying on that and then handing that work to a judge or to a client, well, do you really want to be risking your reputation and your business on it? So this is why the idea of policies is so fundamental, so important. Think about it, not just from are we using it, but what are the implications for our employees, for our customers, for our reputation when we use it in these particular ways. Practices. So again, this is a brilliant time to be able to experiment. And to the degree that it is possible, we should really be encouraging as much bottom-up adoption and bottom-up exploration of people using AI in their tasks. We know already that there is a massive clandestine use of AI in organizations. Frontline employees are hiding their use of AI because they don't want to get sacked for using it, or they don't want to get sacked because the AI is doing their job. In fact, we should actually say, look, this is a really good thing. Start to tell us what you're doing. Share your practices across the organization, and we'll be able to take the best of these and turn these into organization-wide practices. The other side of that coin, though, is that it must be seen that the leaders in the organization are adopting AI as well. They can't just be leading by pointing and saying do. They have to be doing for themselves. Now, the other thing to understand is you should take a good look around at everyone else is using AI and follow the maxim from Picasso, good artists copy, great artists steal. When you see a great practice in another organization, steal it. Here's the thing. Organizations are radically different inside about how they conceive of their workflows and their processes. So even when you steal a great AI practice from another organization, when you bring it into your own organization, it won't be the same practice. It will be adopted into your organization. But right now, everyone needs to be learning from everyone else, both within the organization and outside the organization. That's where best practices can be found. And then finally, we need to think about what we can do to prevent the worst from happening. If you build an agent or a task or a workflow that is automated in such a way that errors in that workflow that were generated by the AI can make their way out to the public or to a client or to the board without being detected, then you probably need to go back to your drawing board and rethink how you've done that. Or when you're designing a workflow, you need to be asking yourself this question all along. How do we ensure that these systems, which are always imperfect, they're very useful, they're good, but they're always imperfect. How can we use them and design them so that we can get the best results from them without risking the business? And again, this means that you're going to be doing collaborative oversight. So it's going to always be a mix of people and systems. And this is where I think one of the visions of AI, where we're basically going to have businesses that are denuded of people because we don't need people to do the operations of the business. This is where this idea falls down, or where it's going to save us tons of money. Because in fact, as you add more automations to a business, you also increase its need for oversight. And that oversight tends to be highly skilled. So it's a really interesting paradox there that, yes, there will be some productivity uplift, absolutely, but cost savings may not go hand in hand with that productivity uplift. So this is something to consider. So again, we've got the policies, we've got the practices, and we've got the protocols. So in conclusion, AI is rapidly getting better. I am not so much an AI skeptic, but I've been using a lot of AI over the last 3 years. And it really isn't until this latest generation of models, of ChatGPT Pro 5.2, Google Gemini 3, and Claude Opus 4.5, when I went, these are actually really good now. These are good enough that I can recommend people to start to use them in their organizations to solve organizational problems. But here's the thing. how an organization adopts AI is going to be incredibly specific to that organization. And it's really going to rely on how that organization is willing to experiment with using AI. And that's going to require both flexibility and openness, because there is a lot of fear associated with using AI. And the best way to counter that fear is to make this an open process of exploration where people are learning how to use the tools to improve themselves, to amplify themselves in their workflow rather than putting themselves out of work. And if a vendor comes offering you this generic AI tool that is going to solve all of your problems, regard that very skeptically. The other thing that we have absolutely learned in the last 3 years is that applications of AI tend to be very specific to an organization, a task, and a workflow. Because AI is not a generic solution. It's an approach, but that approach is then adopted by whatever the workflow is. And that's it for me right now. Now, if you scan that QR code, you'll be taken to a PDF that contains the notes for this talk and all of the slides that you've just seen. Time for your questions.